Week 8 is in the books, and that means that we are through the halfway point of the NFL season for most teams. And for fantasy purposes, it means that we're inching closer and closer to the playoffs. Now, we saw some huge games from some familiar faces at the quarterback position this week, but which one of these guys is most likely to continue being a must-start fantasy quarterback? We'll talk about potential trades including Marshawn Lynch and Vincent Jackson, as well as the return of the starting lineup for Mike Vick. And I'll give you my waiver wire pickups for the week, as well as a few players who you should be buying low and selling high on. It's all on today's episode of the Fantasy Football Swagger Podcast. What is up, everybody? Welcome to the Fantasy Football Swagger Podcast. I am your host, Nick, also known as Kliquid, and I'm here to fix the problems that you have with your fantasy team and help you make the moves that it'll take to get into your league's fantasy playoffs this year. Now, the first thing that I want to do is start off by taking a look at what happened this past week. In week 8 of the NFL season, we had some absolutely ridiculous games come out of two of the top quarterbacks in the league. Those, of course, being Ben Roethlisberger and Tom Brady, two guys who struggled in the early portion of this year, but have really come on here in the past couple of games. Ben Roethlisberger, career highs in yardage, career highs in everything, really. 6 touchdowns, 0 interceptions. He went 40 of 49, 522 yards. Absolutely his biggest game ever. One of the biggest fantasy games that we have ever seen in fantasy football history. Now, he had only thrown 4 touchdowns over his previous 4 games combined. So there's definitely some concern here that Ben Roethlisberger is not going to be able to sustain this type of production. Now, we, of course, have seen some inconsistencies with things like his receivers. You know, we have guys like Heath Miller who are always going to be a reliable target, but aren't really a big playmaker. Antonio Brown has turned out to be possibly the best fantasy football wide receiver this season. I mean, at this very moment, Antonio Brown is the number 1 guy at the position. He would arguably be a top 5 pick if we were redrafting right now. He has been an absolute animal, and that has happened despite the fact that Ben Roethlisberger has been so inconsistent this year. I mean, he's had a couple games where he's been pretty good, but for the most part, he's been down. I mean, this has not been a great year for Ben Roethlisberger. Of course, they don't really have a whole lot going for him this season. I mean, they're not a bad team. They are a 5-win team at this point, but they're not really expected to make a run this season. I don't think anybody's really looking at Pittsburgh as being a Super Bowl contender, but guys like Antonio Brown can produce in this type of an offense. And the nice thing is that Ben does also have other receivers who are starting to come on here. I mean, obviously, we've seen, like I said, the consistent production from Antonio Brown and Heath Miller, but it's going to be guys like Martavis Bryant and guys like a Marcus Wheaton that really make Ben Roethlisberger or break him from a fantasy standpoint. Now, this past week, those guys did pretty well. Martavis Bryant had his best game to date. 5 catches, 83 yards, and 2 touchdowns. He's actually scored 3 touchdowns in his 2 games that he's played. He has been unbelievable to start his career. 123 yards, 7 catches in 2 games. Now, obviously, we're not going to expect that this guy's going to keep up that type of pace, but just the fact that he's able to complement Antonio Brown, I think, is going to add some significant value for Ben Roethlisberger. And then, of course, you had Marcus Wheaton, who had been shut out in Week 7 against Houston, but he ended up catching 5 catches for 56 yards and a touchdown. Pretty much everybody got involved at some point here in this blowout win. So it was a nice thing to see Ben Roethlisberger have such a productive day. But from a fantasy standpoint, what we really need to look at is whether or not this guy is likely to continue at the pace that he had this past week. Obviously, he's not going to continue throwing 6 touchdowns, but what I'm saying is more so, is he going to continue to be a productive fantasy quarterback? And to be completely honest with you, my answer in this situation is probably not. Now, I'm not saying that he's not ownable in fantasy football. I'm not saying that he's not somebody who you could consider starting from time to time. But the fact of the matter is that the Steelers' offense has been super up and down this season. They've had a stretch of games where they were scoring less than 20 points a game. And that's just not good from a fantasy standpoint, especially when you have a guy like Le'Veon Bell who needs to get his touches. If it was a situation where Ben was going to be throwing the ball 40 times a game, then hell yeah, we want him on our fantasy team because he's going to be able to throw for plenty of yards and plenty of touchdowns, but that's just not likely to be the case. I look at it like this. Le'Veon Bell is probably going to touch the ball between 15 to 20 times a game from here on out through the remainder of the season. And what does that leave for Ben? Maybe 30 passes a game, which isn't bad, but it's not great. And that's if their offense is doing well, which they haven't been in the majority of games. So I kind of look at this game as just being kind of more of an aberration. I don't expect it to continue. Like I said, Ben is somebody I think that you could own. It's exciting. Obviously, if you had him in your fantasy lineup, you're probably going to want to play him again this week, just off of the fact that, he did so well for you the previous week. But don't do that necessarily. You have to still look at each individual situation. You have to take the highs as well as the lows just the same. You have to be able to bounce back from them and make sure that you understand what this guy's real value is going forward. And Ben Roethlisberger is probably less than a 2 touchdown per game guy. And that's not bad because most quarterbacks are, but he's not a spectacular fantasy quarterback because he doesn't put up as many touchdowns as some of the elite guys. He doesn't have that high-end potential for the most part. Now, obviously, like I said, we did see him have his absolute ceiling, rock star, Hall of Fame, if he ever makes it, performance. They'll be talking about this game, but I mean, from a fantasy standpoint, it's just not realistic that he's going to continue this. I would definitely be looking at potentially trading away Ben Roethlisberger if I'm in the situation where I can actually get something decent for him. If somebody's out there willing to give you something decent for Ben, go ahead and get rid of him at this point if you have another quarterback that has some value, because quite frankly, Ben's value is never going to be higher than it is right now. So definitely think about doing that if you've got the guy on your roster right now. Now, the other quarterback who had an absolutely monster game, Tom Brady. And he was somebody who I had pretty much given up on from a fantasy standpoint in September. Now, obviously, I've talked about him. I mean, the guy is my favorite he's my favorite quarterback of all time. I was going to say fantasy quarterback, but Peyton Manning, obviously. Come on now. But Tom Brady, I mean, the guy is just absolutely ridiculous. I think that the intelligence that he has in the game is just, it's almost unmatched. There's just a handful of guys like, the aforementioned Peyton Manning and just a couple of other guys who could really even compete for Brady in terms of knowing the situation, making the right play, making the smart play. And that's what he's really great at. But at this point in his career, when he does something like what he's done in the month of October, where he's thrown for 14 touchdowns with 0 interceptions, averaging 317 yards passing per game, I don't think that is logical to continue. Now, I'm not saying that he's going to go out there and start throwing a ton of picks. Brady has always been great at limiting turnovers, and that, of course, goes with the fact that he's so smart. But when you look at a guy like Tom Brady and you see 14 touchdowns with an average of 317 yards over a 4-game span, that's just higher than what he is likely to do going forward. I mean, if you were to take those numbers and actually extrapolate them out, his season would be absolutely ridiculous. I mean, we would be talking about a 56 touchdown season with 0 picks and what 4,800 yards, almost 4,900 yards. I mean, that's absolutely insane. Brady is not that type of a quarterback. Now, what I will say is that the nice thing is that he does have a few receivers who are starting to break out. First of all, Rob Gronkowski is back. I mean, I don't think there's any question about that. He is one of the absolute best red zone threats in the history of football. And that's not just at the tight end position. That is at any single position at all. I mean, running back, wide receiver, tight end, all of those positions. The guy is probably the best pure red zone threat that we have ever seen in this league. And that is not going to change. Tom Brady is going to continue to get him the ball. He's going to score a good number of touchdowns from here on out. And obviously that is something that we like to see for Tom Brady. But the big thing is that guys like Brandon LaFell seem to be emerging as go-to guys. And that's nice because, to be honest with you, Julian Edelman is more of a complimentary receiver. He's not going to be the guy who goes out there and catches for 1,500 yards with 12 touchdowns. That's just not the kind of guy that he is. But what he is a guy who can go short, and he can get the first downs that you really need to keep drives going. So if you have somebody that's able to put up nice numbers in the red zone, a guy that's able to beat him deep like Brandon LaFell can potentially do, and Brandon LaFell is actually an underrated blocker as well, which is something that I think a lot of people overlook in his game. But you've got those two things, and then you've got Julian Edelman underneath. Tom Brady is suddenly looking at a situation where he's got some pretty nice receivers on the field. Not to mention, when Shane Vereen's out there, he's got one of the best receiving weapons out of the backfield. So from a fantasy standpoint, I don't think Tom Brady obviously is going to be on the pace that he was in October, but the fact is that Tom Brady now, when we start to see these other guys emerging, that was the major thing that we were concerned about. The guy had no one to throw to, and now he's got 3-4 guys to throw the ball to. So it looks a lot better for Tom Brady is what I'm trying to say here. I think that if I'm looking at Ben Roethlisberger versus Tom Brady, I'm definitely taking Tom Brady going forward for the rest of the season. Now, he's obviously going to regress from what he's done over the past 4 weeks, but this offense is a lot better right now than they were a month ago. The team is a lot better than they were a month ago. And that just is going to spell great things for Tom Brady from a fantasy standpoint. I wouldn't be surprised to see him approach 30 to 35 touchdowns this season. And I know that would put him on a pretty high pace for the rest of the year, but the guy can do it. I mean, I think that at this point, again, he moves back into the conversation of being an every week fantasy starter. So that's something that we definitely like to see. And it's something that is just, it's good for the NFL. It's good for fantasy football. It's good for everybody at this point, unless you're just a Brady hater, in which case, blah, poo on you. He's an absolute beast. So don't be hating, okay? But anyways, guys, let's move on and talk about another topic, and that is some of the trade rumors that are happening in the NFL right now. So we've got guys like on the Tennessee Titans. Nate Washington is rumored to be being traded. A few other guys throughout the league that really don't have major fantasy implications, but there are two guys who we're looking at as potentially major fantasy implications here. First one, Vincent Jackson. Okay. Now, Vincent Jackson, currently a member of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, has been disappointing this year from a fantasy standpoint. I don't think there's any question about that. He hasn't put up anywhere near the numbers that he did last year, and certainly not the numbers that we would have liked to have seen from a fantasy standpoint. But Vincent Jackson still has skills. The guy is still an absolute giant. He's able to go up and make plays on the ball when it's in the air. Now, he has always been a little bit disappointing in the touchdown category, but the truth is that he's never really been, at least not in the last couple of years, hasn't really been on a spectacular offense. So it would be interesting to see him move to a team that potentially needs another receiver. Now, of course, that could mean a variety of different teams, but the ones that I'm really looking at here as potential suitors for a guy like Vincent Jackson are teams that could potentially still vie for their division title, but maybe need that extra guy just to kind of put their offense over the edge. I look at a team like Cleveland as a team like that. Now, obviously, they had Josh Gordon, and that really hasn't panned out given the fact that he's been suspended all season. Now, we'll talk about Josh Gordon here in a little bit, but he could definitely be added to that offense as a weapon that could potentially help put them over the edge to make them a viable offense. And that would be interesting, because then you're looking at a guy like Brian Hoyer or potentially Johnny Manziel down the road, and you add just a significant amount of fantasy value for those guys just because they have an additional weapon in their offense. And then you look at another team, and I don't know why this one hasn't been more brought up, but even if they're going to trade in the division, I know that's not something that happens very often, but I look at a team like the Carolina Panthers as being like a perfect scenario for a guy like Vincent Jackson. Can you imagine having Vincent Jackson on the field and across from him having Kelvin Benjamin with Cam Newton throwing him the ball? I mean, that is a potentially super dangerous offense. And they've got Jonathan Stewart running the ball effectively now. I mean, we're suddenly talking about Carolina, who's currently sitting atop that division, by the way, at a 3-4-1 record, as potentially running away with that division. So Carolina, I think is a real possible potential suitor for Vincent Jackson. It kind of sounds like that they do want to ship him off. Tampa Bay is in a full-on rebuild at this point, and there's also rumors that they might potentially end up moving Doug Martin, which I find to be very interesting because I don't really think Doug Martin has a lot of value at this point. I mean, I can't look at a team like really any team and say, Doug Martin would be a great fit for them. I mean, the guy hasn't been productive now in 2 full seasons, and he's been bad. I mean, like, not just the fact that he's been injured, but the fact that when he's been on the field, he has been bad. And I just look at that like, are you kidding me? Like, why would anybody want to trade for Doug Martin? So, something to think about anyway, though. Tampa Bay, like I said, full-on rebuild mode. Don't be surprised if they move one or both of these guys in the coming week or two here, because it has to be done. If you're Tampa Bay, you're in a full-on rebuild. There's really nothing that you can do on offense at this point to save things. I mean, they've got a bad quarterback situation. Now, again, Mike Lennon, as I've been talking about, certainly better for a guy like Vincent Jackson than Josh McCown has been. But, I mean, they're not going to be vying for anything this year. They would need to go on an incredible run. They have 1 win right now to even potentially compete for the playoffs. So it's not looking good for Tampa Bay. I do think that they're going to trade one or both of these guys. Now, the other trade rumor that's going around, and this one has been, I'm baffled by this one, to be honest with you. There's been a lot of discussion about Marshawn Lynch being potentially traded away from the Seattle Seahawks, the Super Bowl winning Seattle Seahawks, by the way. They are the defending champions of the NFL, and this guy was basically their entire offense last year. Now, I know a lot of people are going to talk about Russell Wilson looked so good, and he was so good toward the end of the year in the playoffs, but the reality is their offense was completely built around Marshawn Lynch effectively running the ball. There weren't many games out there that Russell Wilson was carrying them, and it's just kind of surprising to see that you're on a team that just won the Super Bowl. You're surrounded by guys like Russell Wilson, who by every stretch of everything that I've heard from anyone is a great guy. And you have a guy like Marshawn Lynch, who's just being a complete detriment in the locker room. It's baffling. And it's not the first time it's happened for Marshawn Lynch. This guy was also traded away from the Buffalo Bills. Now, that was a little bit different of a situation because he was going off of a team that had just drafted another running back. But the thing is, though, is that you look at a guy like Marshawn Lynch and you're talking about a top 10 running back, period. I mean, the guy's an absolute beast. But now you start to talk about the fact that this guy has attitude problems, and we've seen him have issues off the field, plenty of issues. He's kind of a diva off the field. I remember a specific situation where he parked his Lamborghini, or I don't know if it was a Lamborghini, whatever it was, some sweet car, some amazing $1 million car, and he actually used like theater lighting, theater roping, like a post on one end, a post on another end of the car, and then like a rope between it to act like he's, some sort of celebrity. Not that he isn't a celebrity, but like, that's what you're really going to do, dude. Like, you're in public. You're making a fool of yourself. If you don't want your car to be hit, then have it be valeted. I mean, you don't have to make a big mockery of everybody else who's poor just because you're rich. I mean, that's just an asinine thing to do. And I mean, you see situations like that, and it's like, I can believe that Marshawn Lynch is a complete detriment. I mean, I really can. And when you look at that, you really start to question what type of team is going to want a guy like that. Enter the Oakland Raiders. Yeah, the team that hasn't won a game this year. Oakland Raiders. And there are serious rumors going around right now that Marshawn Lynch is headed to Oakland. I just have no words. I mean, the level of stupidity in a trade like that for a team like Oakland would just be astounding, but it's something that only Oakland would do. I mean, really, it really is. You look at a team like Oakland that hasn't been able to run the ball this year. They have Darren McFadden, and they have Maurice Jones-Drew, who they brought in. And these guys were supposed to be a two-headed, monster. They're, two guys that have been so good in the past. Well, look, when you go on a team like Oakland that doesn't have a great offensive line and has a rookie at quarterback and doesn't really have great receiving options, yeah, you're going to struggle to run the football. And if Marshawn Lynch ends up going to Oakland, guess what? Marshawn Lynch is going to struggle to run the football, and they're going to struggle to put up points. So I look at this situation with Marshawn Lynch as a potential sell high right now. And I know that sounds absolutely crazy, but I look at it like this. I don't really foresee a situation where Marshawn Lynch gets traded to a team that betters his fantasy value. The only one that I could even comprehend as being a possibility that would be better for him right now would be A, New England, or B, Denver. Now, that's not to say that those trades are out of the question, by the way. It's very possible. But unless he goes to one of those two teams, where the hell else is he going to go that's better than Seattle for him? I can't foresee it. And I know Seattle's offense hasn't been great this year. Their offensive line struggled at times, but they're a good team. They're a team that puts up points. And Marshawn Lynch's opportunities to get into the end zone are predicated on the fact that their team moves the ball down the field effectively enough that he gets a couple chances at the goal line each game. And that's really where he makes his money from a fantasy standpoint. If he goes to a team like Oakland, or if he goes to another team that doesn't have a great offense, he's going to be a very, very disappointing fantasy player from here on out. So I'm really looking at Marshawn Lynch as being a sell high right now. If you're in a situation where you have Marshawn Lynch on your roster and you can get 90 cents on the dollar for him, I'm probably doing that right now. And I know there's a real possibility that he remains on the Seattle roster through the remainder of the year, And I would actually say that it's likely that he remains on the Seattle roster through the remainder of the year. However, given the fact that they are probably going to be transitioning away from Marshawn Lynch by everything that I've read, his contract situation it basically puts them in a financial situation that they can't re-sign him next year. So they're going to be going in a different direction at the running back position unless something drastic changes. So why, if you're Seattle, would you sit and try to run this guy who you don't really expect to be on your team next year? You're just going to run only him and not get a chance to take a look at any of the other guys that are on your roster, your Kristen Michaels, your Robert Turbins, those guys who are, by all intents and purposes, supposed to be your running backs of the future. Now, I understand the concept of running a guy into the ground and just letting this be the end of his career, basically, in Seattle. And I mean, there's something to be said about that. But if I'm an NFL team, I'm also looking into next year. And I want to see what these guys have. I really, really want to see Kristen Michael out there at some point this season. And I really do think that that's something that we're going to end up on some Sunday. It's going to be Kristen Michael getting 30% of the carries, and then the next week 40% of the carries, and then by the end of the season possibly 50% of the carries if Marshawn Lynch stays in Seattle. So I would like to really give you guys that little tidbit of advice. If I have Marshawn Lynch in any leagues right now, I am probably getting rid of him. And Kristen Michael then I think becomes somebody that you take a look at on your waiver wire, in your deeper leagues right now, because we don't really know what the situation is. And maybe he's a speculative ad. Maybe he's a guy that you go out there and you pick up because it's a possibility that he's going to be the starting running back for this team going forward, and also possibly a Robert Turbin. So definitely look into that, guys, in your individual leagues based on, what your rosters are. If you're in an 8-team league, a 10-team league, probably even a 12-team league, I wouldn't bother at this point just because we don't know. But if a 14-team league or bigger has him out there on the waiver wire, he's definitely somebody I would be thinking about adding this week. So now that we've talked about some of the trade options here in the NFL, I want to move on and talk a little bit about some fantasy football waiver wire acquisitions that you could be thinking about for your fantasy team this week. And at the number one position in the rankings this week, I have Brandon LaFell, and he's a guy that we've talked a little bit about so far on today's podcast. I have Brandon LaFell ranked at number one because I believe that he is going to be the number one wide receiver in New England going forward. I like his upside a lot here in New England because, as we've seen in the past, Tom Brady can make receivers an absolute beast, even from a fantasy standpoint, which is kind of interesting because in the past he has struggled to do that from time to time, but there's guys like Wes Welker who never performed better anywhere other than New England. There's guys like Randy Moss who had their best years in New England. There's guys like, your Deion Branches and your Troy Browns, all those type of guys had great seasons with Tom Brady. And I think a guy like Brandon LaFell could really be coming out of his shell at this point. He's a veteran receiver in the league, but he's still not an old player. He's somebody who could still take the top off the defense, go deep, and definitely score some touchdowns this season. So I like Brandon LaFell's upside a lot going forward. And from a wide receiver standpoint, it's pretty much him and a bunch of rookies at this point. He's really the only guy who's proven that he can be a consistent every week player in the NFL, and I like that. You know, I like the fact that Tom Brady seems to trust him, and I think that he's going to be on the field for most snaps. So given the fact that New England's offense has looked a lot better recently than they did to start the season, I'm somewhat of a believer here in Brandon LaFell. I think that he could be a wide receiver 3, a bench guy going forward, you know, to potentially step in and take the place of some of the other guys on bye weeks, or if you get an injury or something like that. I don't love him as an every week starter from a fantasy standpoint, but you could do worse, I think, than Brandon LaFell. So I definitely like him going forward. The next guy, Denard Robinson of the Jacksonville Jaguars. Back-to-back 100-yard games for this guy. And that kind of came out of nowhere because for a while it looked like Toby Gerhart was going to be the guy. And then Denard Robinson actually got a chance and he didn't really do much. And then Storm Johnson stepped in and Storm Johnson looked like he was going to be the guy. And then not so much. And then they went back to Denard Robinson and, like I said, back-to-back 100-yard games. So that's something that they haven't done all year, of course, from a Jacksonville offense that has been absolutely atrocious. Denard Robinson looks like kind of maybe the spark of life that they needed to potentially be a decent running game. So I kind of like him. Again, not super high on him, but definitely somebody that I think needs to be owned in just about every league at this point. Another running back who I think maybe is starting to creep up into that must-own starting potential is Jonathan Stewart of the Carolina Panthers. With D'Angelo Williams just being completely worthless and basically all the other running backs on that team being completely worthless, Jonathan Stewart has stepped up. 24% of leagues only own him at this point. So he is available in more than 3/4 of leagues. 33 touches over his past 2 games since coming back from a knee injury. Now, 16.5 touches per game isn't amazing, but it's definitely better than what you're going to find on the waiver wire at this point. So I would certainly go out there and add him if you're in a league where you need to add some running back depth. He's not going to be a big time producer. I mean, we've seen this guy at this point. He had one great year, and other than that, he's been just blah. I mean, it's been quite a few seasons at this point that people have been predicting another breakout season for Jonathan Stewart, and I'm certainly not doing that at this point. But there's so many guys out there who, if you're in a situation where you need a guy to start for a week, I mean, there's 6 teams on a bye this week, guys. 6 teams. There's so many running backs out there on a bye, and there's going to be somebody who needs a running back, and I think Jonathan Stewart can fill that void to potentially get you, somewhere between 7 to 12 points in a PPR and, 6 to 8, 9 points in a standard scoring league. I don't see any reason that Jonathan Stewart can't do that with a possibility of sneaking into the end zone as well. So I definitely like him. I think he's probably not as safe as Denard Robinson, as crazy as that sounds, just because we've seen him have such poor production in the past. So, that's why I have him ranked at number 3. Now, number 4 is a guy who is actually a rookie, wide receiver Dante Moncrief of the Indianapolis Colts, who has been starting opposite of T.Y. Hilton. And with Reggie Wayne out, I don't see any reason why he can't continue to produce good numbers. Now, obviously, I don't consider him to be like a starting wide receiver from a fantasy standpoint at this point, but he's done really well so far with the big game that he had this past week. I think that he's going to gain a lot of trust from Andrew Luck, and I think that when you've got a guy like T.Y. Hilton beating the defense deep like he has been this season, there's a lot to be done underneath for a guy like Dante Moncrief. I think that he is definitely somebody that I would be going out there and trying to acquire if I'm in a deeper league and I need a wide receiver for maybe a week or 2 here until Reggie Wayne maybe comes back. I think that there's a good possibility that Moncrief puts up decent enough numbers to be in your fantasy lineup for the next couple of games. Next guy on the list that we have is Martavis Bryant, and we talked a little bit about him when we were talking about Ben Roethlisberger, but this guy has produced 3 touchdowns in 2 games that he's played in so far. Obviously, that touchdown pace is not going to be sustainable by any means whatsoever, but if he continues to be a decent member of the Pittsburgh offense and he doesn't just completely fall off the face of the planet from a consistency standpoint, I think that he could be an okay guy to own going forward. Don't love him, but we'll see over the next couple of weeks. He's definitely somebody, if you're in a dynasty league, that I would be going out there and trying to get as soon as possible if he's not already swiped up in your league. Next on the list, the return of Mike Vick. One of my absolute favorite players. I've probably, I don't know. Has there ever been somebody that I love in Madden more than Mike Vick? I don't think so. I mean, the guy is just absolutely ridiculous, and that's where I originally started to like Mike Vick when he was a rookie. He was a guy that I would draft in all of my fantasy drafts, and it's kind of transferred over to fantasy football as well. I've had Mike Vick a lot throughout his career, and it's been ups and downs, a lot of downs. A lot of downs. But the thing is that Mike Vick has always been able to do it with his legs. He's always been able to put up monster numbers, and we saw it this past week. He only played 3 quarters of football, and he had 70 or almost 70 yards rushing. There's just not many guys out there that are going to produce anywhere near that, if anybody. I mean, you're not going to find somebody that is going to average 50 yards rushing per game like Mike Vick. Nobody. Even Cam Newton, no Andrew Luck, no Colin Kaepernick, no Russell Wilson. It's just not going to happen. So that's why I look at a guy like Mike Vick and I see value in him from a fantasy standpoint. He's got guys like Eric Decker. He's got guys like Percy Harvin. I mean, even Chris Johnson and Chris Ivory potentially can catch some passes. Jay Samaro, if he starts to be able to be a little bit more consistent with his hands, could give Mike Vick a decent target. Now, we don't know that Mike Vick is going to remain the Jets starter, but we do know that for this week, he's going to be their starter. So I like that. I think that Mike Vick has more fantasy value than a Geno Smith ever did. Not that Geno was really even ownable in anything other than 2 quarterback leagues, but Mike Vick is a kind of guy who could really give you, if you're one of the guys who has somebody like your Matt Stafford on a bye this week, for example, like I do in a bunch of leagues, I'm really considering Mike Vick because there isn't many other guys that are going to be able to give you that high-end potential of having a monster game in terms of rushing. I mean, like, for example, let me give you this scenario. If Mike Vick rushes for 80 yards and a touchdown, that's 14 points right off the top. I mean, that's ridiculous, and I don't think that's out of the question at all. I mean, maybe the touchdown's a little bit stretching it, but even if he doesn't get into the end zone, that's 8 points. And then all you really need him to do is throw for 200 yards, and that gets you another 8 points and a touchdown. So that would get you 20 points out of your fantasy quarterback as long as he doesn't throw a pick. Now, Vick is certainly capable of throwing his share of interceptions. We're not gonna try and sugarcoat that by any means. I mean, this dude can throw his share of interceptions. But even if he throws 3 picks, if you're in a league that negatively scores them by 2 each, that's still a 14-point game. And I think that's realistic for Mike Vick. I really, really do. I think that this guy has top 10 fantasy potential while he's healthy and while he's in the game. From an NFL standpoint, Mike Vick is not as good of a quarterback as he is from a fantasy standpoint. There's no question about it. But when you get those points for rushing, he suddenly becomes extremely valuable. And if he ends up getting into the end zone with a rushing touchdown, I mean, the sky's the limit for this guy as far as fantasy production goes. I don't expect to ever see him again throw for 400 yards in a game, but, a 250-yard game and a touchdown or 2 through the air and maybe, 50, 70 yards rushing, huge fantasy game. So I definitely like Mike Vick, and I think that he's somebody that should be targeted in a lot of leagues this week. If you've obviously got, your elite quarterback, don't bench them for Mike Vick. But if you're on a bye this week with your quarterback, think about it. Just think about it is all I'm saying. Couple other guys worth speculative ads in your leagues. If you're in deeper leagues, Justin Hunter starting to look better for the Tennessee Titans. Jonas Gray is potentially going to be the kind of, I don't know if I want to call him the RB1 because I think Shane Vereen still probably is, but he might take more of a role than, your other New England running backs. And maybe not as big as Stephen Ridley, certainly, I don't think, but certainly bigger than the other guys in the offense, which could make him a decent sometimes play. It's going to be really tough to see what he does from a week-to-week standpoint just because the New England offense is so unpredictable. But, think about him anyway. Look at what he does this week if you are inclined to pick him up. And then Allen Robinson of the Jacksonville Jaguars has continued to produce decently. Charles Sims is also somebody that I'm really looking at. If Doug Martin does end up getting traded away from the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, as it really looks like he might, Charles Sims is a guy who could possibly step up and take that role over a guy like Bobby Rainey. So think about him. Look, especially if you're in a dynasty league, I like the possibilities of him being their running back going forward. Last, Josh Gordon. I know it's crazy, but Josh Gordon's going to be back in week 12. As far as it looks like anyway. We don't know that for certain at this point, but that's what it looks like as far as from a suspension standpoint. So Josh Gordon back in week 12. If you need somebody, I mean, you could do worse. Josh Gordon was the number 1 fantasy receiver last year. He was probably the number 2, but I think he led the league in yardage. So, I mean, that's absolutely crazy that he's going to be available at this point in your fantasy season. He's going to have to, of course, gain some sort of confidence with the quarterbacks and, and really grow with the offense, because he hasn't been able to even practice with these guys or anything, but the talent is there. The talent is there. So, I mean, it's a possibility that if you're in a league where you are probably going to make the playoffs and you have some guys that you can potentially throw away on your roster, think about picking up Josh Gordon, because he could be there for you in the playoffs. So, last thing that I want to do is take some of your fantasy questions here. And then, of course, I'm going to give you my buy low and sell high players. So the first question comes from Colton's GT on YouTube, and he wants to know, who do I like better as far as upside goes going forward? Do I like Brandon LaFell or Julian Edelman in a standard scoring league? And in this case, I certainly think it's Brandon LaFell, being that it's a standard scoring league. In a PPR, I think that it's closer. Julian Edelman's, definitely going to catch more passes, I would say, going forward. But the high-end potential with the touchdowns and the big yardage, I think, goes to Brandon LaFell. We've seen him gaining confidence from Tom Brady over the past couple of weeks. So definitely like to see that out of him. And, if he's out there still in your league, like I said, I have him as my number one ad this week for waiver wire acquisitions. And I stand by that, because I do think that he's going to produce nice numbers going forward. Number 2 comes from D. Dwayne 17899 on YouTube, and he asks, any opinion on Brady going into this week? Am I better off starting Kaepernick against the Rams, because he put up good numbers against them a few weeks ago? And just to let you guys know, Tom Brady up against the Denver Broncos, and that's actually the reason that I like Brady. Now, not that Denver's pass defense has been bad, but they haven't been great, let's be honest. But I think that Brady is going to have to put up a ton of points to be competitive with the Broncos this week. And that's why I actually like him, because I think that he's going to get more pass attempts than he normally does. So I definitely like to see that. Colin Kaepernick is somebody that is so up and down that it's hard to predict whether he's going to give you a good game or a terrible game. And the thing is that his high-end games really haven't been that great. So, normally I would say Colin Kaepernick, just because he could run for a touchdown, but we really haven't seen that much out of him this year. So from this week, at least, given the fact that Brady has been on such a hot streak and Denver is going to put up points and they're going to need to pass, I'm going to go with Tom Brady this week. So good luck with that. Third question comes from Owen Fenton 99 on Twitter, and he wants to know, yo, Kliquid, it's halfway through the season and I only have 1 win in fantasy football. Is there anything I can do? Thanks, man. Love the vids. Well, first of all, thank you for watching the videos. I do appreciate it. I know this is a tough situation for you to be in. You're sitting here at 1-7 after your first 8 weeks of the season. If I'm being honest with you, there probably isn't a whole lot that you can do at this point. And I hate to say that, because I don't want you to throw away your season. I don't want you to stop updating your lineup for the sake of the other people in your league, of course. But it's just, you're 1-7, man. It's too late at this point, most likely. But what I will tell you is that it's possible, depending on your league scoring system, that you could still sneak into the playoffs, depending on how it's set up. Now, I know there are a lot of leagues out there where you can actually make the playoffs. For example, if it's a 10-team league, what'll happen is that they'll have 4 teams make the playoffs total. It'll be the first 3 teams will be the 3 teams that have the best record, and then the 4th team will be the best remaining team with the total points. So record completely forgotten with the 4th team. It's all about how many points that you've scored. So if you're in that kind of a situation, my assumption is probably that you're pretty low in points scored, but that's actually easier to come back from than it is your record, because you're at a 1-7, and even if you do run the table from here on out, you're probably going to be 6-7 at the end of the year. So that's not a great situation to be in, possibly 7-7 depending on how deep your league goes. So I don't think it's likely that you're going to make it on record, but if you have a league where you could make it on points, what I would be out there doing right now is looking at my roster and deciding which guys I can trade away. Which guys on my current roster have the highest value? If you're sitting there, and my guess is that you probably are with somebody like an AJ Green or a Calvin Johnson, because that's what ends up happening, is people think that they can sit and wait on a guy like that to come back. I would be looking to trade them immediately, because you need to put up points now. You cannot wait. You absolutely cannot wait. And I understand Calvin Johnson and AJ Green are guys who are going to put up big points at the end of the year. I really do believe that both of them will be top 10 fantasy wide receivers when they get back. but we need points this week. We need to start putting up as many points as we can. So if I can trade Calvin Johnson away and get somebody like, an upgrade at running back and add a Brandon LaFell or something like that, I'm probably doing that trade at this point because I need the points now. I cannot wait. I'm going to go out there onto my league's message board and I'm going to say, Calvin Johnson's available. Give me your best offer. And I'm going to try and get people in my league to make the best offer for that type of a player. And that's the same thing with any other player. It doesn't have to be somebody who's currently injured, although those are the guys that I like to trade away because, other people that are a playoff contender, they need their players for the final couple of weeks of the season. Whereas you need, even to have a chance at the playoffs, you need to run the table or you need to have massive points. So think about doing that kind of a thing. Hopefully that will help you out. Without looking at your roster, I can't really tell you exactly what type of a move to make, but things like that are the things that you need to be doing to even have a chance. Last segment today that I want to go over is my buy low and sell high. I've got a couple guys this week, and I'll try and rip through them as quickly as I can here. My first buy low is Cam Newton. Now, I've been talking about how Cam Newton, I think, is a sell high earlier in the year, but now it's getting to the point where I think he's becoming a buy low because Cam Newton is kind of being looked at as a borderline starter at this point in a lot of leagues. He's not putting up the fantasy points that we would expect him to. This past week, he was absolutely dreadful against the Seahawks. And to be honest with you, he just hasn't looked like the great quarterback that we've expected him and what we've seen from him in the past couple of years. But he has an amazing schedule coming up. He's got New Orleans, Philadelphia, Atlanta, Minnesota, New Orleans, Tampa Bay, Cleveland, Atlanta. What part of that is scary? I mean, those are some of the worst defenses in the NFL this season. Absolutely atrocious teams. And Cam Newton could put up huge numbers in some of those games, or he could put up duds. I mean, it's really tough to know with a guy like Newton, but I think the likelihood of him having good games from here on out rises. So I'm definitely buying Cam Newton from this standpoint, from a point that he is at his low, in my opinion, right now, to I believe that he's going to do better from this point on through the rest of the season than he did for the first half of the year. Another guy, LeSean McCoy, has been absolutely disastrous as a number one overall fantasy pick this season. He went number one in almost all of my leagues, other than a few where Adrian Peterson went number one overall, and that was even worse. But LeSean McCoy is still, I believe, one of the top 3 or 4 most talented running backs in the NFL. They just haven't been able to put it together on offense. They're definitely struggling with the fact that their offensive line hasn't been healthy, but they are going to be starting to get healthy over the next couple of weeks. A couple of guys are going to be back, and I think that LeSean McCoy's upside is going to rise from here. He's really had a struggle over the past couple of weeks, and I just think that things are going to get better from him from here on out. I do think that he's going to get used more in the passing game as well, which is, of course, helpful from a PPR standpoint. So if you're looking to add somebody who's a potential RB1 going forward, who you might be able to get for less than what you would have drafted him for, well, at least, obviously you're going to get him for less than what you drafted him for, but, less than what his perceived value was even a couple of weeks ago, I would be looking at LeSean McCoy. I think that you can still get stud numbers from him for the rest of the year. Next on the list, I've got DeAndre Hopkins and Julio Jones. Both guys have been kind of meh over the past couple of weeks, but from DeAndre Hopkins' standpoint, I like the fact that he's getting almost as many targets as Andre Johnson. He has 20 targets over the past couple of weeks, and Andre Johnson has 21 targets. So they're almost identical in that category, which is really what we want from a receiver. We really just need him to be targeted. These guys are talented enough that they're going to be able to catch the ball eventually. So I like Hopkins. Earlier in the year, I called him a top 20 wide receiver, and I still think that he could be top 20 to top 25 through the rest of the year. So definitely look to see if he is available. If somebody that has depth at the wide receiver position is looking to move him, I would be jumping on that right now because I think his value is pretty low and I think you can get him for a decent price. Now, Julio Jones, I think that he has been so disappointing over the past couple of games here in matchups that you would perceive to be ones that he should be able to thrive in, that people could be looking to move him just because Matt Ryan has not been good. He hasn't been good at all. But Julio Jones and Matt Ryan have cakewalk schedules from here on out. It's almost the same as the Cam Newton situation where, yeah, they've not looked good over the past couple of games, but where do you go from here? How do you go down from what they've been doing? I mean, these guys are going to be up against some bad teams, and they are going to be having the potential to put up huge numbers. So I absolutely love Julio Jones going forward. I still believe that he is a borderline top 5 fantasy wide receiver from this point through the rest of the year. He's going to have plenty of targets, and he's certainly the wide receiver 1 in an offense that should be better than what it has been doing over the past couple of games. Now let's talk about our sell highs for the week. Number 1, we've got Ben Roethlisberger, who we've talked about earlier in the show. I think Ben Roethlisberger is the ideal sell high. Now, who is going to buy on him is the real question, but it could be somebody who's in a tough quarterback situation. You know, if you're in a league where somebody needs their quarterback for this week, if they've got, you know, a guy that's on a bye or somebody that's been struggling, like, you know, if they're a Cam Newton owner, for example, or a Matt Ryan owner, and that's the guy they've been relying on, I would be definitely looking to potentially ship off Ben Roethlisberger to that person as long as I have a decent quarterback to back him up, because Ben Roethlisberger is not going to continue the pace that he was at over this past week. I foresee him being more like a 1.5 touchdown per game guy, which would mean that he is going to be okay from a fantasy standpoint, but not spectacular. So I would think that from a fantasy standpoint, his value is probably going to drop from here on out than from what it's currently at. So think about potentially trading Ben Roethlisberger. The other person, Brandon Cooks. Brandon Cooks is in a New Orleans offense that gave him 2 touchdowns this past week, one of them on a run, on a jet sweep around the outside, and then one of them on a reception. But guys, this just isn't sustainable. We haven't seen Brandon Cooks put up big numbers all year. Now, he has put up decent numbers for a rookie wide receiver, and he's somebody that I do like for the future. But I think Brandon Cooks is getting a little bit overrated just based off of the fact that he scored a couple of touchdowns this past week. I've heard people talking about how he's suddenly an every week starter for fantasy, and I just don't believe that. I mean, this guy is going to be inconsistent. We've seen inconsistency from every wide receiver in the New Orleans offense ever since Drew Brees took over, even Marcus Colston. So, I mean, to think Brandon Cooks is suddenly going to step up and be a guy that you want to start every week in fantasy football, I'm just not buying it. Jimmy Graham is the only guy in this offense outside of Drew Brees and maybe now Mark Ingram that I would be looking at even as an every week starter for fantasy. So, Brandon Cooks, I would definitely be looking to move him. Another guy, Golden Tate. With Calvin Johnson coming back, I think Golden Tate is another guy who's an ideal sell high. He has been putting up ridiculous numbers with Calvin Johnson out. And, I mean, he's basically been putting up wide receiver 1 numbers. So I do still think that he has the potential to be a wide receiver 2, and he's going to be the wide receiver 2 in the Detroit offense once Calvin gets back. But I still think Golden Tate is somebody that I would be looking to ship off to an owner who is looking for a wide receiver that maybe doesn't pay as close of attention to the league, and maybe they don't understand exactly why Golden Tate is getting as many receptions as he is. That's the person that I would be targeting to trade to. So last person on today's list as a sell high is somebody that I have been telling people all season about, and this is a guy that coming into the year, I was singing his praises as being a guy who I think is going to be potentially a top 10 wide receiver, and he has turned out to be that. That is Emmanuel Sanders of the Denver Broncos. Now, I know what you're thinking. Why are you wanting to sell Emmanuel Sanders? And it has nothing to do with the fact that I don't think Emmanuel Sanders is going to be a great receiver going forward. I do. I really, really do. But there are a lot of people out there right now that are buying into this 3-touchdown game that he had this past week. I'm telling you guys, Emmanuel Sanders is going to put up big numbers this year, but it's not going to be in the touchdown category. He might put up 7-8 touchdowns on the year, but that's not going to be enough to really sustain him as being like at that elite level of receiver, like the guaranteed rock solid wide receiver 1 on your fantasy team. And that's what some people are perceiving him to be right now. So if there's somebody in your league right now that is looking at Emmanuel Sanders and they're loving them some Emmanuel Sanders, and you can potentially trade him for a great value at another position, or potentially another guy that has been producing well, or maybe you trade Emmanuel Sanders and you get back a Calvin Johnson and somebody else, that's something that I would really be thinking about doing. I think that that would be a wise decision from a fantasy standpoint, because I do think that Calvin Johnson's going to outscore Emmanuel Sanders once he comes back. And if you can get something else on top of that, there you go. I mean, that's a smart trade to make. So I hope you guys enjoyed today's episode. That is going to wrap things up, and I just want to thank everybody for tuning in. I know today's episode was a little longer than normal, but I mean, there are just so many different things that you need to do at this point in the fantasy season. This is really crunch time, guys. You have to make the right decisions. You have to do what is right for your fantasy team. You can't just go based off the players that you love. You have to make the smart choice going forward in order to make the playoffs and in order to set up your team to win in the playoffs. So I hope you guys learned something. If you did, please be sure to press that like button, and also be sure to press the subscribe button below so that you can be updated when I put out my next episode of the Fantasy Football Swagger podcast. If you guys have any questions about your lineup for this week's games, or if you're thinking about making a trade, or even if you just have a general fantasy football question like some people have, make sure that you leave them in the comment section below, or of course you can tweet them to me at Kliquid TV on Twitter. Thank you guys so much for listening. I do appreciate it. Be sure to check back later this week for a preview of this weekend's games here on the Fantasy Football Swagger podcast.